Щиро дякую за того, що ви все прийшли. I will speak in English. Can you hear me? No. No. Let's try again. Is that better? Is that better? I think it's on. Okay. So let me start over. My name is Kathy Wanner. I thought I would explain a bit about who I am, the kind of research I've done here in Ukraine, and the kinds of qualitative methods that I've used to do this research. I think that Ukraine is in particular an excellent place to use qualitative methods. And I have I've always been sorry that more people don't use qualitative methods, because I think, especially for a very complicated place like Ukraine, what you need, in fact, are qualitative methods to understand the society today and the changes that are taking place in Ukraine. So let me say a bit about who I am and what I will be speaking about today. As Svetlana said, I am a cultural anthropologist. I've been doing research in Ukraine now, I counted, it's 27 years. That's a long time. My first research site was Ukraine, and my first book was about how Ukrainians understand their own history. And after that, I thought, oh, well, I'm going to work someplace else. I'm going to do my research someplace where it's easier. But I ended up coming back and writing another book about Ukraine. And then I ended up coming back and back and back. And I've already decided that my entire professional career is going to be here in Ukraine. I'm certain of that. I don't ever even think about doing research in anywhere else. After I first began doing research on historical understanding, and in particular, how historical understanding is expressed in space, in the city, in the places where we live, and that's how Svetlana and I got to know each other, I moved from that into doing research on religion. And that's a theme that I have been working on now for about over 15 years. And that, of course, is fantastically interesting, and I don't imagine, at this point, moving away from the theme of religion. So those are the issues that I've researched, and I've researched them as a cultural anthropologist. So when I first came to Ukraine and I said I was an anthropologist, people would say, oh, I know of a wonderful collection of bones. They're of monkeys that were found in such a place in Africa, you must see them. And I would say, but I'm not interested in bones, and I'm not interested in stones, and I'm not interested in anything that's in the ground. And so then I began saying, well, I'm an ethnographer. And then people would say, oh, there's a great museum with models of these old, styles of housing and old styles of clothing. And I would say, but I'm not really interested in the 19th century, and I'm not really interested in clothes and vyshyvanka, and it's beautiful, but that's not what I'm doing my research on. And so in the end, I ended up saying I was a sociologist, because at least people then understood that I was interested in the present and that I was interested in human beings, not their jewelry, not their stoves in their house, and certainly not their bones. I'm interested in people, and I'm interested in people as they live today. But of course, I'm not really a sociologist, because I work with qualitative methods. And so I would like very much to see others who are interested in Ukraine, in whatever aspect, work with qualitative methods. And especially I would like sociologists too to work with qualitative methods. And as the discipline of anthropology is just beginning now in Ukraine, I would really like to help in this process of bringing along the study of the culture in Ukraine. So let's begin. So these are the themes that I would like to talk about today. That is to say, what are qualitative methods, right? I think very often, we need to start at the methods that are recognized as scientific certainly in the United States and in Europe, but have not really been embraced in Ukraine. So I'd like to talk about what they are, why they're useful, why you should be interested in qualitative methods. And when I write to whom, I mean especially who should be thinking about qualitative methods. And then I'll speak a bit specifically about how to use them well, and what happens when you use them poorly, which happens too, of course. So to speak about how to use them, and in particular about the ethics, then I'll be speaking specifically about the ethics of qualitative research, but it's important to think about the ethics of research. And I'll explain why this has become such a very big issue, certainly in the United States. I'll give examples from the United States, but I would say that's also true in Europe as well. And in speaking of those first 4 points, I will be drawing, there were 2 articles, I believe, that you were sent. And so one will draw from the article on ethnographic interviews. And the second will draw on an article that I recently wrote about ch.1. And there I hope to show you how, using qualitative methods, you can begin to explain to someone not only why the Maidan happened, how people feel about it, how space and the places where a person lives, how that might shape how you see yourself, how you see your community, how you see your nation, how you see your state. In short, how we can take the data that we get through qualitative methods and then apply them to a particular question and help other people understand something new about Ukraine, for example. Okay, so that's what I hope to do today. After each section, I'll also, as Sveta said at the very end, before we take a break, we'll pause for some questions. But after I go over each theme, I'll also ask if anybody has any questions. Okay? So I'm very receptive if I'm not clear, or believe me, I've been in your position many times listening to things in Russian or Ukrainian, and I know it's hard. So if there's something you don't understand, just raise your hand. I'm certain if you don't understand it, then there are others that don't understand it. So don't hesitate. So let's start. Let's begin to think about what are qualitative methods. I'll go in depth into each of these points, but I want to stress for the moment that participant observation is what is seen as the main method that anthropologists use. This is what is distinct to anthropology. Related to participant observation are a variety of related methods: interviewing, taking notes, which that might seem very simple and unimportant, but writing about what you see, the details of everyday life, the details of a particular interview, how the person was dressed, where you took the interview, what their facial expressions were, the tone of voice, and all of these kinds of details can be very, very, very revealing. So these are the kinds of things that anthropologists will record. There's also the practice of recording what are called life histories or biographies. In other words, understanding how and why a person's life developed the way it did. Why does somebody make certain choices? And issues about kinship, and in particular fictive kin. Kinship is something that, for example, early anthropologists used to focus quite a bit on kinship. That is to say, to chart how people are related to one another. And the idea was that in modern societies, that really wasn't necessary. But of course, the second I came to Ukraine, I realized in one sense that assuming that how people are related to one another and how they understand those relations are very, very important. And because you have not only the practice of people actually being related, but people being what anthropologists call fictive kin. Just to give an example, in the beginning, in English, when people speak about, let's say, my brother, that literally means the person who has the same mother and the same father as you. And if they don't have the same mother and the same father, then they're not your brother. But of course, as you know, people say all the time, mi brat, це зробив, people say things like this. And I would say, but I didn't think you had a brother. And he would say, oh yeah, no, this is my brother. And I think, oh, okay, I guess I didn't understand something. Only to then realize over time, it's what perhaps we would call a cousin, or a second cousin, or simply somebody who you treat as if they're a cousin. We would never use the word brother. And so I realized that things like the anthropological practice of mapping how people see their relationships to each other is very, very, very relevant, and it can be very relevant in Ukraine. And similarly, the practice of, while I'm speaking about fictive kin, the idea of, let's say, a kum or kuma, we have godmothers and godfathers, but it means something totally, totally different. What's that?
Not in all cases, but
yeah. But so these are some of the ways in which kinship, for example, what might seem that's not interesting, but it actually can be quite interesting, as well as issues of folklore. I found myself, in one sense, going back to those ethnographers and going back to a lot of the why folklore has a certain meaning, and why a people might use folklore to define themselves. And finally, as a final point, anthropologists very often gather up all kinds of, whether it's objects, material objects, documents, maps, video recordings, audio recordings, and photographs, because all of these can be other kinds of evidence. Evidence to make a particular argument about the way we either have misunderstood things in Ukraine or should understand things, or some other point that one wishes to make. All of these kinds of objects and ways in which we can capture a moment, whether it's be visually or voice, these can be very, very important as well. And so anthropologists gather all kinds of material this way as well. All of this together is called ethnography. And ethnography is seen as the main qualitative method for anthropologists. So in other words, the use of qualitative methods is to produce ethnography. One of the most famous anthropologists was actually a man who was Polish, Bronislaw Malinowski. He decided to do research in what is today called Melanesia. These are small islands off the coast of Papua New Guinea. Very, very small, isolated islands. But unfortunately, bad luck for him, while he was in the South Pacific doing his research, World War I broke out. And as he was then considered an Austrian citizen against the British, he was obliged to stay there for many, many years, many more years than he ever expected. But the fact that he was obliged to live there for a long time, that gave him really the opportunity to do all of these things, and to do all of these things in depth. And as a result, Malinowski is widely embraced as one of the best anthropologists that's ever lived, and he's really considered a classic among anthropologists. And I think here, he stated very early on, here I wrote in 1922, he said that the goal of ethnography is, quote, to grasp the native's point of view, his relation to life, to realize his vision of the world. And this is an idea that has informed anthropology and informed the use of qualitative methods. So what does this mean? What he means is that really it's the job of someone who uses qualitative methods to be something of a cultural translator. Everybody knows what someone who translates, say, from English to Ukrainian is. But how about translating the way things are understood in Ukraine and translating it into terms so that someone, let's say, in America could understand? Translating concepts, some of which don't exist in our society or in our language. Translating habits, traditions, and practices that maybe also don't exist in our society. And translating, things like, why do you have a Maidan? Why did you have an Orange Revolution? Why is there corruption? Many, many big questions like that very often are given very simplistic answers. And qualitative methods is a way of trying to explain by capturing, if you will, the native's point of view, to understand how Ukrainians themselves saw the Maidan and the meaning of the Maidan, for example. And how, on some level, that reflects his or her vision of the world, right? Because the vision of somebody who lives in Kiev is perhaps not the same as the vision of somebody who lives in Moscow, or New York, or Paris, or wherever. And the idea is to try to humanize, take that person and things that seem strange by explaining them, by placing them in a greater context to somehow make them familiar so that a person then comes to understand another cultural context. So part of it is to take what's strange and make it familiar. Similarly, if you were to use qualitative methods, you might want to then do the reverse. That is to say, to take what seems completely familiar and give it a new perspective, make it seem strange, make people think about that. Why actually is it that way? Or why do we do that? Why do we say that? So that's the goal in one sense. By grasping the native's points of view, you want to try to take something that's strange and make it familiar. Or take something that's familiar and make it strange. But in each instance, you're trying to build understanding, and in particular, build empathy. So, for example, when I write about Ukraine, I would like somebody in America who cannot even imagine what the Soviet Union was like, who cannot imagine what socialism was like, who maybe they can't even imagine what colonialism is like, so that they can understand that a bit. Someone who can't understand why protesting, how that could ever be a good thing. That's always bad. There's some people who think like that. But you want to take a person who thinks like that and make them see protest, the Soviet Union, whatever it is you're writing about, religion, whatever it is you're writing about, see it in a new way, from a new perspective. And one of the ways you do that is you begin to tease out different perspectives, what one refers to as the emic or the insider perspective. Right? So for example, you living here in Kiev, being Ukrainian, you would have, let's say, an insider perspective on this society. I, with my outsider or edict perspective, I've spent a long time here trying to understand the native's point of view, if you will. Obviously I come with different eyes and different understandings of things. And so with my own mind, with my own cultural baggage, I'm trying to understand your life. So I'm trying to bridge that, the insider-outside. And I think that's really the goal of anthropology. And James Spradley, in the article that you got, wrote, and I think this is a very good statement, ethnography offers us the chance to step outside of our narrow cultural backgrounds, to set aside our socially inherited ethnocentrism, if only for a brief period, and to apprehend the world from the viewpoint of other human beings who live by different meaning systems. So it's this idea of cultural translation, of making the familiar seem strange, or making the strange seem familiar. Because you can begin to understand it. You begin to understand what things mean for another person, why they make the decisions they do. And if you understand why they make the decisions they do, you perhaps think a bit differently. You can perhaps see problems and issues in a different kind of a way. So any questions or comments so far? Okay, I'll carry on. But as I say, don't be shy. So why are they useful? Why are qualitative methods useful? And here I think is the main reason why I think they're so useful in this country. Because qualitative methods very often are capable of teasing out the differences between what people say they do and what they actually do. I think that sociological research is wonderful. I think I support sociologists, I wish them well, but they record what people tell them things, and they record that. And sometimes that's true, but not always. Not always. My favorite is the expression, it's impossible, but maybe we can do it. These kinds of, when you ask to be able to do things, very often the answer here is no, it's not allowed, but maybe we can. And in getting to the heart of all the different times and places, what does that mean when it's impossible, but maybe we can do it? And it's pulling apart the differences there. Let me give you an example. So everyone thinks that, corruption is bad. And there's a lot of talk these days about how bad corruption is. And I think most people would think that's bad. But then you have to think, well, why does it carry on? If so many people think it's bad and don't want to live in a society that they think is corrupt, why? I mean, we're 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why do we have it? And so somebody like me begins to watch then people who will say it's very bad, very bad. It's terrible that, people don't do things in an honest way. But very often when their children become older and they want to get their children jobs, what do? what do? They start calling people, right? Or they want to get their child into a good university. You can do all kinds of different things, right? When you encounter those situations where it's impossible, but maybe we can do it. And so somebody like me who uses qualitative methods will say, well, excuse me, isn't that kind of like the kind of corruption you were just saying is bad? Doing things by social relationships, by znakomy. I mean, even just this word znayomy, we don't have this difference in English between sort of an acquaintance and a friend. In English, we just speak about friends, right? You're my friend, you're my friend, you're my friend, everybody's my friend. We don't distinguish these. But of course, you have all kinds of gradations of just how close that person is. And it's because very often you tend to think in terms of maybe favors, right? I mean, so in other words, very often when I've pushed people, well, if you think corruption is bad, and people should honestly get a job, right, because they're qualified, but yet you're calling around, how is that possible? People will say, well, we're old friends, and of course I'll help him if he ever needs anything, and I've helped him before, and so you realize that there's ways of thinking about favors or obligations. Sometimes you feel obliged, right? If somebody calls you and says, my son needs a job, and it's maybe, you think, okay, I know it's wrong, but I have to, for some reason, help this person. And so it's a way of then, so all of these are very, very revealing, because it shows the ways in which people will understand, let's say something like corruption, when other people do it, but the way they understand it when they themselves do it. And so for somebody like me, who's trying to translate this into into sort of an American way of thinking, or somebody who doesn't live in Ukraine, who just says, oh, it's a horrible country, it's so corrupt, right? All those statistical analyses that say it's not transparent, there's no respect for the law, et cetera, it's easy to think it's a bad place. But you try to translate it into, Americans would certainly understand favors. They would understand that, right? I mean, Americans do favors for each other. And Americans, of course, they do have friends in the real, what you're talking about, friend kind of, or somebody who you're very close to, who you can't say no to. That's a phenomenon that Americans, of course, understand. And so if you begin to explain that corruption, of course, on many, many different levels, from working with the school teacher to trying to get a permit to build a building, all of these things, they trade on social relationships and how